30 seconds. 20 seconds. 10 seconds.
Hi,
My name's J.C. McCauley.
I'm Naisha McCauley, and you're watching AccessTV.org.
Good morning again. This is Jonathan Small, host and producer of All About You. And All About You is one of two different programs that I have the pleasure of hosting and producing live every single week at AccessTV.org studio. All About You is a show that's designed to give you, the viewers, some information and backgrounds related towards the guest's life story. And this morning we have a very remarkable individual who's been through a tremendous amount of adversity, obstacles, but it's definitely overcome and really making a tremendous difference in many different areas of society. The guest this morning on All About You is no other than the executive director of the Woman at Well Transition Center located in the Metro Atlanta, Georgia area, no other than Bishop Donna Hubbard. Good morning, Bishop Hubbard. How are you doing? Bishop Hubbard?
I'm blessed. How you doing, Jonathan?
I'm doing
You and your team. Look, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. And it's our pleasure to have you on as a guest.
Okay.
Bishop Hubbard.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
I appreciate it. Thank you, John.
You're welcome. Bishop Hubbard, where were you born and raised at to start off this particular program?
Well, I am a unique individual. I was actually born in Atlanta, Georgia, and I actually live in Atlanta, Georgia. But I was raised a little bit throughout the U.S. I was raised in Jackson, Mississippi, and in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm. You remember about Jacksonville first? You said Jackson or
Jackson, Mississippi.
Jackson, okay. Do you remember enough
No.
about Jackson? You don't?
Yes, absolutely.
okay.
We actually went from Atlanta to Pittsburgh first.
Okay. Which area did you like the most growing up as a child?
Let's see. As a child, well, I grew up in Pittsburgh.
Uh-huh.
So I was really fortunate to grow up in an area that was very diverse.
Yeah.
So it was very integrated in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And so I had a really diverse background.
Did you like...
And so I'd have to say Pittsburgh was a great place to start, but I moved to Jackson, Mississippi in the height of the civil rights movement. So I also got a chance to be embraced by my culture and by the events of the civil rights movement, and to be engulfed in the civil rights movement at a very impressionable age at 13.
Well, was that tough for you to go through as a child during the civil rights era and the civil rights movements? I'm assuming we're talking about segregation and other issues relative towards that.
Sure. In Pittsburgh, again, it was very integrated. When I moved to Jackson, Mississippi, it was right after Hurricane Camille had hit New Orleans, and in Jackson, Mississippi, it was very segregated, which I was not used to at all. And so and having a diverse background, my mother is Catawba Indian, and her background is Indigenous American and African. And my father is Nigerian. So moving to Jackson, Mississippi was really challenging for me because I wasn't used to being discriminated against. I wasn't in that rights and human rights in Jackson, Mississippi. My mother and my dad, she had remarried. So my mother and my dad became literally civil rights icons in the Jackson, Mississippi area. They're both very well known throughout the South and through Mississippi. Hollis Watkins was my dad, and Naya Watkins, my mother.
Now, Bishop Hubbard, did you learn a lot as a young age that kind of made you, let's say, grow up a little bit faster than a normal child, in your opinion? Just making a comparison to Jackson, Mississippi, to Pittsburgh. But it seemed like to me you've kind of lived simultaneously, well, not simultaneously, but you've kind of lived a little bit of balance. You spent time in Atlanta, you spent time in Jackson, you spent time in Pittsburgh. But would it be fair to say that maybe the time you spent in Jackson had more of an impact on your life than, let's say, Atlanta and Pittsburgh?
It's interesting you say that, Jonathan, because I never thought of it that way.
Mhm.
But I'd have to say Jackson was the most impressionable of the places I lived in formulating my my personality and my perspective on life and the way that I interact with people. I definitely say that Jackson, Mississippi had a great impact on that because while I was faced with discrimination in ways I had never experienced it before, again, my mom and my dad, who were entrenched in the civil rights movement and the Pan African movement, kept us very current. And so we were constantly learning about our culture and appreciating our culture. Hollis Watkins came from a very rural area of Mississippi, Summit, Mississippi, and Macomb, Mississippi. And my mom was she was very diverse in that she had a background in Atlanta, but she also had Pittsburgh, and she knew that there was a movement happening in the country. Nayo knew that there was a movement happening in the country, and she wanted us to be prepared for that. But she also wanted us to always embrace who we were as Indigenous Americans and as African Americans. And so, in the process of living in Jackson, Mississippi, adapting to a different time with the civil rights movement, um, my mother became a part of the Nation of Islam, and she was introduced to the Nation of Islam in Jackson, Mississippi, and so we became part of the Nation of Islam in the late 60s, early 70s,
Hmm.
which was a very impressionable time. There was a lot going on with the Nation of Islam. It was just beginning to really begin to just beginning to grow in numbers, but it was also having a presence nationwide, from California all the way to New York. You there were Muslim communities, and so we became part of the Muslim community. I think my mother probably did that partially because she wanted us to feel a sense of security in that we had a community around us, because the community we lived in was integrated, but you did not have a lot of support in the civil rights movement in those communities. People came from all different kind of backgrounds, and some people were still full of fear. It was still hard to register to vote and to hold protest. So it was. I'd say that Jackson, Mississippi, had the greatest impact on formulating who I am today, and my perspective on life.
Now, would you eventually, I guess, at some point, return back to Atlanta? Was that more towards your adult life when you returned
Yes.
back to Atlanta?
Well, we always went to Jackson, Mississippi. When we lived in Pittsburgh, we always went. We always came to Atlanta
Hmm.
to visit my grandparents, because they stayed here for a long time. But once they moved up to Pittsburgh, my mother was the youngest of their children. So once they moved up to Pittsburgh, my grandfather had worked as a porter on the trains for many years, and my grandmother had run the barbecue joint that they had here in Atlanta. But at the point where my mother moved to Pittsburgh, they were getting older. The interesting thing about my grandparents is that my mother was born when my grandmother was 49. My grandfather, I think, was 61. So by the time I came along and I was my mother's oldest, my grandparents were up in years.
Hmm.
So they moved to Pittsburgh with us. And for them, even, it was hard. It was a shock to them to move from a very segregated Georgia to a very integrated Pittsburgh. I think um, one of the most impressionable moments in my life with my grandparents was to hear my grandfather being called a boy. And that really, even today when I think about it, it shakes me in my core because my grandfather was my hero. And so we always came to Atlanta to visit my grandparents, where my grandfather was, a pillar of their community here in Atlanta. And coming back to Atlanta really was about coming back to my roots. It really was. It was about coming back to where Donna began. The first chapter of my autobiography is called Growing Up Donna.
Mm-hmm.
And so coming back to Atlanta for me meant coming back to my roots, really coming back to find out what it was about this area that my parents and my grandparents were attracted to.
Well, Bishop Hubbard, you have done a lot with your life, and you're involved in many different movements and organizations trying to help human trafficking people in many different levels throughout the world. But you've went through a tremendous amount of obstacles and adversity, like I mentioned in the beginning introductions. How did your life sort of got off track where you got caught up into some vicious cycles towards your adult life?
You know, Jonathan, the when I growing up
Mm-hmm.
in the middle of the civil rights movement and then going through Islam, I have to say that the movement we have today, the Black Girl Magic movement that we have today, didn't exist when I was coming up.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of my I think part of where my road became wobbly, we'll say that, where my road became insecure and unstable growing up and becoming a woman, was that there was no Black girl magic. I really struggled to find my identity. I was married at a very young age, having joined the Nation of Islam. I was married off at 16 years old, and while I did graduate and went on to go to college, it was a struggle just to do that. And so I was really looking to fit in where I didn't fit in. I was longing for a sense of identity because I had always been somebody's daughter, somebody's mother, somebody's wife, but I didn't know who Donna was. And all of that has been a process of learning. Going through Islam gave me a sense of integrity that I have held on to, but it also made me very vulnerable in other ways. So when I was out on my own, having left my husband, and here I was, a young mother with children, I was exposed to a lifestyle. I was exposed to a lifestyle I wasn't accustomed to, and I was groomed to be trafficked. I didn't know that's what it was. I met this man who told me he loved me. This was after I was divorced. Here I am, a young mother with children looking for a great job, and I found this great job as a flight attendant. And I met this man who told me I was the most beautiful thing he'd ever met, and he took me to parties and dressed me up and introduced me to all kinds of people. And I was exposed to a lifestyle that caused me to become vulnerable to traffickers. And so I was raped and left for dead, not once but 3 times, and ended up going to prison with having been trafficked. By then, I was being trafficked by a gang who had gotten hold to me again. I just really became vulnerable because I was looking for love in all the wrong places. And I thought that if he said he loved me, that he was there to do some good for me, but I was vulnerable and I was naive. So I ended up being trafficked for 7 years. And the only way I escaped my traffickers was to go to prison.
Mm-hmm.
And I never thought about I'd ever have to go to prison. I'm a young mother, great potential, articulate, educated, but I was naive and vulnerable. And I didn't have a support system. I had a great family, but I did not cling to any support system because I felt like I didn't fit in anywhere. And I ended up being trafficked, and my only escape from traffickers was to be incarcerated, which meant I lost my freedom, I lost my children. And even though I lost my ability to move around, I actually became more free after I was incarcerated because, see, I was in prison already to A lot of my idiosyncrasies. My traffickers controlled me with drugs, and like I said, I was beaten and left for dead 3 times, and they used drugs to control me. And so I was already in prison before I became incarcerated. And so once I was incarcerated, I learned what it meant to be free, to really think on my own. And I figured that I would find my identity when I had a chance to stop and think, because my mind was finally clear. I wasn't controlled by drugs. And the interesting thing was, when I was introduced to Christ, it was right before I went to prison, and a woman came to the prison. She and her mother, Pastor Lynette Higgins Orr, came. She and her mother used to come to the prison and to the jail where I was, because I had been arrested with the traffickers on drug charges. And but I couldn't talk about anything because my life was being threatened and the lives of my children were being threatened. So it was very clear I had to keep my mouth shut if I wanted to stay alive and keep my family alive. And so I Pastor Lynette Higgins Orr brought fried chicken dinner to the jail that I was in on Sunday, she and her mother, and they brought the gospel of Jesus Christ as well. And I figured that if he was the God that they said he was, what would he want with somebody like me?
Mm-hmm.
But the reality was, I just didn't feel that I was worthy.
Right.
And I remember the day that she told me, don't cry anymore. Talk to God about it. And I couldn't understand what to say, or even if God would accept it. But I got on my knees in that jail on a floor of a dusty gym and a raggedy couch that had a spring sticking up in the middle of it. And I cried out to God. And Jonathan, I stood up after she put her hand on my shoulder and she led me to Christ and to confess Christ. And I stood up, and there's a song, an old gospel song that says, I looked at my hands and they looked new. I looked at my feet and they did too. And I knew that my hands and feet weren't new, but all of a sudden I had a different perspective on life. I had a different perspective on who I was. I had a different perspective on my future. And I had hope that I hadn't had up until that point. So I began to understand that I was going to have to go on a journey that meant going to prison. It wasn't my choice. It wasn't God's choice. But God will use the choices that we make to get us to where he wants us to be. And so when I went to prison, I literally began to do the work of rebuilding Donna and into Dara, which is what my family calls me. That is my real name, my African name that my mother gave me. So I went from being Donna to being Dara. And I started doing the work that I'm doing now in prison, of really helping other women begin to see ourselves as strong, as independent, as worth it, as worthy. And I have to say that going to prison allowed me to get free.
Well, Bishop Hubbard, it's kind of curious to find out, because when you say human trafficking, sometimes people may get the impression that this just started recently or not that long ago. But I'm just trying to find out, which decade were we talking about, and which city did you get caught up with your husband or whoever who had, I guess, controlled your life? I'm just trying to figure out, is this Jackson, Mississippi? Is this Atlanta? Or is this
No,
Pittsburgh?
I left Jackson, Mississippi, and I went to Los Angeles, California, and for a job. I'm sorry, I went to Miami, Florida for a job. And it was in Miami, Florida, that I began to see that trafficking was something common. It wasn't just prostitution. It was so much more than that. When I got my job as a flight attendant, when I was still in Pittsburgh, and I got my job as a flight attendant, I ended up being groomed there. Like I said, I was beaten and left for dead, and I couldn't recover from it normally because I couldn't even talk about it. And I left my job, I left my home, and I moved all the way to Los Angeles, California, where I thought that I could get away from my memories. And it was there that the gang got a hold to me. When I ran from Los Angeles with my children, I became pregnant and had a baby, very young baby. And at that point, my mother had moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota. And made it possible for me to come there to recover, to get my life back together. And I had a brand new baby. When I got there, um, oddly enough, I got a great job. It was an internship at WCCO television. Excuse me, at WCCO television. And I started doing a story as an intern on gang infiltration and crack cocaine in the Minneapolis area. I couldn't talk about my own background because I was afraid and I was embarrassed and I was ashamed. But I took the assignment without ever telling them, look, I've had an addiction before. I've been exposed to this lifestyle before. I didn't say anything. And within weeks of that, I was exposed to some of the same people that I had ran from in California. I was exposed to in Minneapolis. And it was in Minneapolis that the federal marshals arrested us for drug trafficking. They didn't know anything about the human trafficking at the time, because during that time there was only you were either a prostitute or a whore, and there was nothing in the middle. Nobody was talking about human trafficking, even though the trafficking of people of color has been a common practice for centuries, not decades, but centuries, because the trafficking of people of color began in slavery, and it began even before that, and it happens throughout Europe, and it happens throughout South America and in Asia. So it did not just begin. But here in the States, once we thought slavery was over, we didn't think about human trafficking. But trafficking is so much more than sexual exploitation. Trafficking is force, fraud, and coercion. And it is human trafficking, drug trafficking, weapons trafficking. It is organ donors, child brides, child soldiers. And so human trafficking encompasses so much more than drugs and sex. And my only escape from my traffickers, who had learned how to use all of those to exploit the people that they were trying to exploit. And if you think about it, when we think about drugs, we think about guns and drugs. When we think about gangs, we think about drugs and guns. But we never wonder how those gangs got the money to buy the drugs or the guns. Mm-hmm. And so it's been, it's been a learning lesson. It's been a learning process for me. But now that I've learned, I am challenged and I am charged by God to pass this information on. So it's important for me to represent this population of people who have been trafficked, not just sexually exploited, because it was so much more than sexual exploitation. And that's one of the reasons when I finally went to prison, I couldn't even talk about it because I didn't know how to verbalize what had happened to me. It wasn't just selling me on a corner, because when I became pregnant, I wasn't always out on the corner, but I was being trafficked. I was being exploited. And so I was being controlled. Again, trafficking is force, fraud, and coercion. And for me, it was coercion, because I was told point blank, either you do what we tell you to do, or we'll take one of your daughters, or kill all of you. They didn't spare us. They didn't spare me, and I believed that they would do exactly what they said they would do. And so I made sure that if I didn't do anything else, I had to keep my children safe, and I had to live through this so that I could go to the next level. I had to live through this so that I could survive to tell the story. I just knew that there was something more there had to be something more to my life than just the prison experience.
Well, excuse me. The stage where you're at now, currently as the executive director of the Women at the Well Transition Center, it seems like to me your life was patterned to shape up towards leading to this particular stage from some of the previous or past experiences that you have been through. And tell me a little bit about how I think you did mention it briefly, but just clarify again. How did you establish, or how did you become the executive director of the Women at the Well Transition Center?
Thank you. So while I was in prison, I started working with other women like myself. One of the things about prison is you feel isolated. You feel like that what happened to you didn't happen to anybody else. But what I found with the women that I met in prison is that so many of us shared the same experiences. and they overlapped. The human trafficking overlapped with drug trafficking, and then overlapped with domestic violence. And there was so many overlapping factors that I began to really look at, how can I make a difference? How can I come out of this experience with something better? And so I literally began helping women look for their cases in the law library, filing appeals, writing letters to their local churches to help their families with their children. Um, I started working with women who had children to begin to reach out to their children, because I learned that parenting was not just presence but participation. And so because I was a mother myself, I had to participate in my children's lives, even if it meant hearing some very difficult things that my children needed to say to me to let me know how they felt. But for some of us, it meant that when our children said those things to us, we just literally shut down. And I remember women who just stopped feeling anything because it was too painful to be separated from their children. And that's a place I never wanted to be in. I never wanted to get to where I had no feeling. And so I started working with these different women. And then um, when I got out of prison, there was no place for me to go to get help, to get resources, to get support. I came to Atlanta because this is where my father was. And that was the only place they would allow me to be released to, because I had a family member here. And I didn't want, my mother already had my children. I didn't want to bring the burden of my reentry into my family. So I went to Atlanta. And when I got to Atlanta, there was an organization here that's run by a woman named Sandra Barnhill, Forever Families. And that was the only place I could go. I went to her office, I sat down, and I cried for an hour because I couldn't even articulate what I was feeling and to begin to think about how to rebuild my life. But she gave me a place to begin to put my life back together again. And I found that the greatest way to heal myself was to help others. And so by being a part of Forever Families, which was called to Aid to Imprisoned Mothers at the time, that I would have a greater connection to where my pain was and the source of my pain, and I could also help to heal that, physician heal thyself. I could help to heal myself. Remember that I had also accepted Christ, so I had a task on my life. I had a mission, and I had a charge on my life to do what God had called me to do with this newfound freedom and this newfound identity. And so I worked with Sandra Barnhill, and at one point she said to me, you really do want to work with the women who are incarcerated more than the children. And Sandra wanted to work more with the children of incarcerated women. And she gave me a space, and she gave me the freedom to do what I felt God was calling me to do. And we started putting together a group of women who, like myself, had just been released, who needed clothes, find a job, find a place to live, and a support system. And we started with maybe 4 women, and we grew to 8 women, and then there were 11 women. And we would meet every other week, and we would talk about, who's hiring. I have clothes. This place is giving away clothing. This place is hiring. This place will let you get an apartment. And then after a very short period of time, I'd say about a year and a half, some of us started going back to prison. And it really caught me off guard. And I felt like I had failed them in some way and not provided the resources I needed to provide, because, we would bring women in from Morehouse and Spelman to talk to us, women who were entrepreneurs, women of faith, and to talk to us about, how to put our lives back together again. But I felt like something was missing. And what I realized is that when we get out of prison, if we don't have that nurturing, supportive environment to come to, that our likelihood of successful reentry was very slim. And so I literally said, I've got to do something about a place for women to come to when they get out, so that they can get their lives back together again, because we were still in communities that did not embrace us. And because, see, a man can get out of prison and he's a hero because he survived. A woman gets out of prison and now she's a bad woman. She's a bad mother. And who wants to take that girl home to her mother and say, oh, here, mom, I want to marry this woman. And oh, by the way, she just got out of prison. And so at that point, I really sought God on what I was supposed to do with this group of women. And I, I wrote this letter to George Soros, who is a philanthropist. and I told him what I wanted to do. I thought I had written this great grant because by that time my mother was writing grants. And so I thought I had written this grant that, was very impressive. He wrote back to me. Surprisingly, he wrote back to me and wrote a letter on yellow legal pad and said, Donna, this is really nice. I was like, nice. But he said, but I really want to know, how did you go from where you were to where you are now? How did you put your life back together again? And I really sat down and thought about it. And the foundation of Woman at the Well Transition Center is accountability, commitment, and consistency, because we have to learn to be accountable to ourselves and for ourselves if we're ever going to be accountable to and for anyone else. We have to we have to be accountable. We have to be committed. If I'm not committed to the girl I look at in the mirror every day, I'm not going to be committed to a God I don't see or my children or anyone else. And then finally, it was consistency, because it's only what you do consistently that really does cause changes in the quality of our lives. And so I had to learn to be accountable, committed, and consistent in order to rebuild my life. And those are the principles that I brought into Woman at the Well Transition Center. And I thought about the fact that that woman in the Bible, and that woman told Jesus, what are you asking me to do something for you for? I'm nobody. And he said, if you knew who I was, you would ask something of me. What was more important is that when he sat down, he told her all about herself. He didn't tell her about all the people that had hurt her, all the people that had betrayed her, all the people that had misused her. He told her about herself, and that's what set her free. And I have to say, that's really what gave me a sense of identity, is being able to understand who Donna was, and looking at me and helping myself first adapt to the principles of the Bible and the principles of accountability, commitment, and consistency. And so that thread runs throughout our programs, our projects, and our foundation and our mission. And so Woman at the Well Transition Center came about as a result of me wanting to provide a stronger support system for women who were getting out of prison than the one I came out to.
Well, it seems like currently at this stage of your life, between being a flight attendant for a major commercial airline, being the executive director for the Woman at the Well Transition Center, and being a bishop, and I know you do speeches. I believe you were a part of the Revelations Seed, if I'm saying it correctly.
Yes.
And I've seen you in the past on the Bobby Jones gospel show, and that was very impressive, a very impressive testimony on your part.
Thank you.
So it's like you have your hands full with many different levels. What are your future plans beyond what we have discussed that you are kind of moving towards? And we're trying to get the ending stages now of where you're moving at going forward towards this next chapter in your life.
Absolutely. Revelation Seed was a powerful influence in my life. These 5 women and Bishop Margaret Reynolds, who is our spiritual mother, and she's also the founder of Revelation Seed, helped me to understand that there was value. I'm worth it. In fact, one of our songs is Better Than Better, which really was about having better than better. And we deserved better than better. And so that really keeps me moving forward and helps me to continue to do the work that I'm doing with Woman at the Well Transition Center. And so we have 7 different programs that run throughout prisons and jails. We train human trafficking. We do human trafficking awareness trainings for law enforcement, public health professionals, the faith community, and aviation. I mean, I've been involved and designed the training for more than 1,700 law enforcement officers, about 900 public health officials, 1,300 faith leaders, and 3,500 aviation professionals. That includes pilots and flight attendants. And we are part of a network that are consultants for the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and have a global presence with GTOC and IATA and ICAO and several other international organizations. And so our work now is not just about supporting women who are getting out of prison, but also women who are impacted by human trafficking, and how do we help them rebuild their lives. And so that we have evolved from just doing a parenting program in prison. which helps women understand that they have to remain involved with their children. To what do we do now once you are out with this newfound freedom? So many of us, when we look at the statistics, 21% of the men who are incarcerated were primary caregivers of their children, where you have 73% of the women were the primary caregivers. So our programs involved not just parenting, but reentry, job training, education, and entrepreneurship. And then building a network of survivor leaders and subject matter experts. So all of that is part of the platform of Women at the Well Transition Center. But what I have found as a result of visiting around the world, I have literally traveled around the world and had an audience with the King of Dubai, the King of UAE, the United Arab Emirates, and the King of Qatar about human trafficking. And I've spoken in those countries: Latvia, Romania, Iceland, Kuala Lumpur, Jakarta, Bangkok, Manila, throughout South America, Peru, and El Salvador, throughout Canada. One of the things I found is that even though we have programs all over the world, what we don't have is a safe place for women and girls to come to once they are rescued. Because we see movies and we hear stories about these brave rescues, but we don't talk about what happens to these women once they are rescued. What's next is what's important. And so as a result, it's been in my heart for a long time. What am I going to do when I retire from the airline industry in a couple of years? And the vision for the Well Woman Ranch was born about 3 years ago. And this is going to be a ranch that will house women who from all over the world who will be rescued and to come to us to be restored, to be recovered, to be refreshed, and to really re-enter the mainstream and re-enter the lives of their children and families. And so we on the ranch, we will not only grow produce to sustain the property, because there's something very therapeutic about a woman who puts a seed in the dirt and nurtures it and waters it and watches it grow and weeds it and sees something that comes out of the dirt that nourishes others. And it gives us a sense of worth. And then I know it sounds weird, but I want to be a beekeeper. I want to make honey. And so I did it. I'm doing this because I don't want my children and grandchildren and great grandchildren to only remember the bitterness of my life. I want them to remember something sweet. And so the honey will come from the Well Woman Ranch as well. And then we will also have our other projects that we have right now. We have a candle making business that helps to support some of our programs called Light in the Darkness. And some of the other programs and projects that will happen on the ranch will be centered around helping women rebuild their lives. So the Well Woman Ranch is scheduled to open in 2026, and I'm excited about what's going to happen with that, and the vision for the Well Woman Ranch of being able to see women and girls have a place where they are safe and can be restored, and we enter into a nurturing environment. Such as the Well Woman Ranch and all of the agencies that we partner with and that support us, and where that goes.
Well, Bishop Hubbard, that sounds like an excellent way to end this particular segment. As a person in the aviation industry, it sounds like the sky is the limit. And definitely, you seem like to me you have a game
Yes,
plan. As you say, you're going to be getting close to our retirement. So it's good that you got your plans and your map pretty much set in place, if it's God's will for you to move in
Amen.
that direction. So it's a real inspirational type of interview having with you this morning. As I always say to the guests towards the end of the show, if there's any last things or words, anything that you are looking to do a little bit briefly, please feel free to do so.
Thank you so much. I just, I'm thankful for that God saved me. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity, Jonathan, to come on your show, All About You, and really highlight everyday people and the not so everyday experiences that we have. I think that's an extraordinary vision. And I appreciate the opportunity to share my life story. There's so much more that's coming in my book called, my book is entitled Meant to Be. and it'll be coming out very shortly. So look for the launch on Facebook. And I want to encourage women who may be and girls who may be entangled in what is human trafficking, even though it may feel like my boyfriend just wants to share me with the rest of the world, or someone who literally is entangled in coercion and being threatened not to do what they're being asked to do, to reach out, because there's someone there that cares. There are agencies throughout the U.S. that can make a difference, that can help you get free, that can help you find yourself. And you can always look us up online, Woman at the Well Transition Center. And you can reach us. You can reach me at PastorDonnaHubbard.com or PastorDonnaHubbard.org or Woman at the Well Transition Center.org. And the number, you can share my number, or they can go online and look for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, definitely. I definitely appreciate you again being available, giving somewhat of an inspirational testimony about your life, being real candid, being real frank, not really holding back anything. And it was definitely a good, inspirational learning experience for people out there in the viewing audience to learn something about not only your life, but the life of what people similar to your backgrounds have been through and are going through, particularly with human trafficking, which is a major problem in our society. So again, keep up the good work, keep up the faith, and it was a pleasure again having you as a special guest this morning on the All About You talk show.
Jonathan, thank you so much. I would be remiss if I did not mention that there is a man who took a chance on me that others never even thought would happen, and that is Archbishop Q.S. Caldwell from Celebration of Praise Ministries, who made me the first woman bishop in the Celebration of Praise Ministries network of 113 churches. And I really am grateful that he saw something in me that others didn't see. He saw more in me than I even saw in myself. And so I'm thankful to Archbishop Q.S. Caldwell as well.
Another tremendous honor that you have underneath your belt as well. Keep up, and as I said before, keep up the faith and keep up the good work. Okay.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Bless. God bless you too. Okay, this is Jonathan Small. Just enjoyed hosting this edition of All About You with the very special guest, the executive director of the Woman at Well Transition Center, located in the Atlanta, Georgia area. And it was definitely an inspirational, highlighted, passionate, very sincere interview segment that Bishop Donna Hubbard has given to the viewers. Have a show and topic all lined up next week. We will be doing a face-to-face talk show. We'll be down in the city of Miami talking about a major organization on a national movement. But as I say to people out there every single week, have a very blessed day and keep the faith. Thank you.